but a stir is its own pulse sequence because it starts with this 180 and it takes the signal of fat out. Everything pretty much looks dark because we're only trying to look at pathology that's going to be bright. Our stirs, the TE is kind of middle of the road, right? It's, remember, on our stirs, we're using around a 40 to 60, okay? The reason for that is because if I take all of the signal from fat out of my image, I don't have much signal left. Then I use a long TE, I'm cutting more signal out as well, right? Because I'm waiting a long time to get the echo. Therefore, my signal's weaker because I'm waiting such a long time, right? So with a stir, we back that TE back to that 40 to 60 to get signal back into my image. So where I work at, and I think many institutions don't call it a T1 stir or a T2 stir, they just call it a stir, okay?
And typically a longer TR, I think the book was around 3,500.
For the stirs.
For the stirs.
Yeah, or
not
anything.
Really T2 weighted, but I mean, long enough so that you can get those TEs in.
Well, a stir, I think we could use anything like 2,000 or above.
Right.
Then think about TR, again, is more of a T1 issue. TE is your T2 issue, okay? So, to simplify things, I don't think of a stir as T1 or T2 weighted. It's a stir, okay? When I think of fat sats, spur and spare, that now is T1 or T2 weighted. That makes sense?
Is a spare going to be the T2 weighted one?
Correct. Generally, yes. And spur is going to be a T1 weighted. That's the fat sat we're going to pick for T1. And I realize that I hate how Philips did this because it is so confusing. In a Siemens, you know, you're going to turn on fat sat, and you're not going to have spur and spare because that's only a Philips thing. And that's why I'm not getting too in depth with spur and spare because there are some other usages of you could do a T2 spur, but we're not going to go there because that's only Philips dependent. On a Siemens unit, on a GE unit, I turn on fat sat. Simple. And I make it either T1 or T2 weighted depending on my TR and my TE.
So
Okay.
you, in that case, it's like not a stir, it's you're doing
Right.
a spare or a spur.
Correct. Yes.
So
A
you're either-
stir is a stir. That's a whole nother, that is separate than a fat sat. So I can do a stir or I can do a fat sat here, okay? One or the other. If I do a T2 fat sat, that is where we put the volume box on, right? And we want to shim as minimal amount of air as we can, okay? Do we use the volume box on our stirs? No. When you do a fat sat, we want to shim on that peak of water and fat. We want to eliminate as much of that fat signal as we can. Sometimes when we are doing a fat sat, and in particular when we're doing a fat sat off of isocenter, so I'm laying in the magnet, this is isocenter, but my knee, okay, let's say I'm a bigger patient here, but my knee's over here, right? Anytime that you try to, here's my center, anytime you try to shim off of isocenter, sometimes your fat sats won't be uniform. It won't saturate that fat very well. And we call that then that, our fat sats didn't turn out very nice. If you are doing a fat sat and you cannot get a good fat sat, let's say you can't do a stir post contrast because you have to do the T1 fat sat. But if I do a fat sat that doesn't turn out pre-contrast, let's say mostly T2 weighted, what other pulse sequence then could you throw in, which would make it look like you're doing a T2 fat sat? Stir, right? Does that help?
Yeah, that helped a lot, actually.
Good, you're good, okay. Because those are two different pulse sequences, but they both give us similar information. And more in particularly, a T2 fat sat and a stir. Because if I have a tumor that I'm trying to look at, or a mass, and my T2 fat sats are not turning out real well, that means my fat's kind of bright and my tumor's really bright, and I can't see the difference where these edges are at, throw in a stir. Because I don't have to worry then with a stir about that off lateral trying to shim my fat and water peak so far from isocenter. And it mostly is in particular when we're talking about extremities, because my extremities are always going to be off lateral, right? Unless you have a really, 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 really skinny person and you can get that shoulder into the center, but then their arms like laying on the side, right? Most of the time you cannot get your extremities perfectly at isocenter because they are to the sides of us, okay? So hopefully that helps.
Yeah.
Good, very good. Okay. Looking at this image, do I see a patella? So what do you think this is, medial or lateral? Okay, and you're correct. So if I'm looking at your meniscus here, would this be anterior or posterior? Anterior horn of the medial meniscus. Posterior horn of the medial meniscus. You will have to label that for image ID next week. You can't tell me that is the medial meniscus. You have to tell me, is that the anterior horn or is it the posterior horn of the medial meniscus? Okay? Okay. Here's a coronal image. I know it's dark on the screen. If you look at your laptops there, can you see, we know where the tunnel's at. Can you figure out how it's easy to, I don't want to say easy, but it's more, it makes more sense that this comes down into this tibial plateau, and I know that my ACL attaches to the anterior tibia, right? So when you see within this tunnel, the ligament that lies along this aspect and it attaches anteriorly, you can assume that's your ACL. Okay? This ligament over here is going to be your PCL. But again, when we're doing our setup, we have all those coronals to page through. So we can page through back and forth. We could even find the fibular head and say, oh, yes, that's for sure lateral, okay? This is an axial slice. The axial slices that the radiologist utilizes information for this, not only in this area, but it looks at the cartilage that is behind your patella. And we can tell the thickness of that cartilage on our axial slices. That's probably the best reason for this axial. Diagnostic-wise, we like to do these axials because I need to figure out how to set up for my sagittals and coronals, right? Okay. Any questions on how to set up for the knee? we do the 3-plane pilot, we do some bilaterals, then we go to the affected